The shed rattled like a metal lung, breathing wrong, and Bear, a 3-year-old male Alaskan Malamute, with a torn right ear, pressed his nose to the slats, and tasted iron in the blizzard. Hannah said, "Ilias, where's Mira?" and her voice skated on panic. Ilias said, "She was on the porch a second ago," but seconds in a storm stretch like wire. Ash, a gray male barn cat, crouched on a beam with his tail puffed, eyes lantern wide. Outside, the hawk's shadows slid across the white yard like a knife with no hand. Bear remembered the small human's apple slices and the way she laughed at his snow sneeze. He huffed, "Small star" in the language of breath, and pushed his shoulder against the loose door. The wind answered with a scream that sounded almost pleased with itself. Hannah shouted, "Bear, find her!" and fear hit the room like a dropped bucket. Ilias fumbled for the latch with numb fingers and said, "Go, boy, go now." The wood bit Bear's claws as he tore splinters free and felt the storm's teeth waiting. The shed smelled of hay, oil, and the sweet ghost of Mira's mittens. Bear lowered his head and decided night would not take the child who fed him kindness. The latch surrendered with a squeal and cold punched the shed like a fist, and Bear burst into the yard, fur lifting in flags as if arguing with the sky. Hannah said, "Find Mira," and her hope cracked at the edges. Ilias said, "Go, boy," and slammed the door against the storm's hungry palm. Bear leapt to the porch where the red mitten waited like a dropped word no one wanted to read. He inhaled cinnamon, milk and wool, and the scent painted a line through the dark. He murmured, "Small star, hold on," and his chest hummed like a stove no wind could shake. The world shoved back in icy heaves that made his whiskers sing. Ash slipped along the rail like a small gray rumor and vanished down the steps. The porch light cast a trembling halo where snow swarmed like bright insects. Bear set his paws into the powder and chose the path of the last clear prints. The house behind him glowed with human heat he refused to keep for himself. He lowered his head and let instinct pull like a tide toward the pasture. Above, the storm sharpened, pleased with its game, and dared him to play longer. The toddler's tracks cupped snow like tiny moons, curving past the woodpile and stuttering toward the open pasture where drifts breathed. Bear lowered his head until his whiskers brushed ice and followed the warm ribbon of scent threaded through pine pitch. He said closer with a rumble that steadied his legs. A fence post groaned under rime, a voice of old wood remembering summer. From the paddock, the old chestnut mare watched, her winter coat glossy with frost pearls, the witness who never speaks but always knows. Ash ghosted the top rail, a gray stitch in a white seam. The hawk's shape dragged the moon a notch lower, then dissolved into the storm's teeth. Bear paused where the prints blurred to smudges, then to guesswork. He tested the air and caught the sugar milk note again, delicate and brave. "Hold on," he told the night, and the night shook its head like a stubborn bull. The wind shoved a sheet of snow across the field, as if sweeping a board clean. Bear angled for the trees where scent loves to hide from weather's tricks. Earlier, Mira, a 2.5-year-old female toddler in a Blue Star snowsuit, had chased her yellow palm hat as it danced off the porch, giggling, "Hat, come back!" The game ran until the wind changed the rules. The white field opened like a blank book that wanted to be written in her small feet. Fear slid under her coat and pinched. She said, "Mama?" and the word vanished as if swallowed by wool. She tucked herself behind a fallen log, knees up, red mittens clapped to cheeks. The creek's voice whispered secrets about slick stones and cold sleep. Overhead, a hawk hunched into its feathers and watched, not a villain, just a witness made of wing and bone. Snow stitched itself sideways, sewing sky to ground with bright thread. Mira hiccuped a song fragment, a brave sound with thin boots. The log felt big as a wall, and she told it, "I wait." The storm tested each button on her snowsuit like greedy fingers. Somewhere, a dog's bark punched through the cloth of the night, and hope moved inside her like a small spark. Bear reached the field's lip where prints unraveled into wind-scraped smears, and his tail flagged once in alarm. He sang a short, sharp howl, a locator for humans who understand distance by sound. Hannah heard and said, "He has her trail." And the kitchen walls learned to breathe again. Ilias said, "I'm going to the fence," and grabbed the headlamp like a promise. The wind tried to shove Bear backward, but he leaned into it and made the night take his weight. "You can't have her," he told the weather, and the weather laughed snow into his face. Ash slipped along the fence post tops, a moving comma to Bear's sentence. The chestnut mare stamped, sending a drumbeat through the ice-packed ground. Scent pooled near the tree line, sweet and fragile, then pulled deeper into the dark. Bear plunged for the pines where shelter and danger wear the same coat. Between trunks, the air went quieter, and his ears caught the creek's thin music. He thought of apple slices and small hands, and the thought sharpened his stride until the storm had to work to keep up. The kitchen clock clicked like a brittle insect, and Hannah, a late-20s female with a dark braid, stabbed redial and said, "Leena, please pick up." The kettle wailed and made the room sound haunted. Ilias, an early-30s male with a short beard, snapped a headlamp tight and said, "Power steady, I'll mark the drive." The window shivered with wind that wanted in. Hannah said, "Mira hates the dark," and the word hate came out as steam. The house smelled of wet wool, lemon soap, and fear trying to be useful. Leena answered at last, voice flat with training, "I'm en route. Keep lights on and set a marker." Hannah said, "Bear's tracking," and her hope tried to sit still. Ilias taped a neon tarp to a post and said, "I'll sweep the fence and call if I hear him." The storm rattled the vent hood like a door. The night kept testing. Hannah pressed Mira's star blanket to her mouth and whispered, "Stay warm in it until I have you." The floor creaked as if the old wood had prayers. Ilias squeezed Hannah's shoulder and said, "We move smart, not wild," and the words steadied the air. Leena, an early-30s female SAR handler with a black beanie and reflective jacket, snapped Koda's crate latch and said, "Kiddo in trouble, partner." The 5-year-old male German Shepherd quivered like a bowstring. Chains bit the truck tires and set a rhythm under the radio hiss. Leena told dispatch, 9 deploying, rural grid 8, blizzard conditions. The valley's ridge lights winked as if keeping vigil. She said to herself, "Follow the land, but trust the dog more." Map lines glowed on her dash like thin rivers of heat. Koda put his nose to the blanket she'd bagged and sneezed, then looked forward as if a line had been drawn for him. Leena said, "Good boy, anchor that scent," and rolled out with deliberate hunger. The wind battering the windshield felt like a living argument. A thermos thumped against the console like a small drum. She remembered winters where breath counted as time, and she decided this child would have more minutes tonight. Bear, a 3-year-old male Alaskan Malamute with a torn right ear, threaded the pines and carved a trench with his chest. His breath came in engines that smoked. He let scent write maps on the inside of his head, and those maps said milk, wool, and scared. A twig scored his flank like a pencil mark, and woke more heat. He said, closer, with a throat sound older than fences. Snow hushed the ground until each step sounded like paper. A coyote barked thinly from the ravine. A hungry wire pulled taut. Bear stared into the dark and answered with a growl that remembered wolves. The storm flickered, easing then tightening, like a hand deciding how hard to squeeze. He caught apple on the wind and turned with purpose sharp enough to cut. In his ribs, a drum kept time with Mira's small fear, and it sped him forward. Mira, a 2.5-year-old female toddler in a blue star snowsuit, crouched by the creek where the world turned black between whites. She said, "Mama," and the creek kept her voice like a secret. The yellow palm hat sat crooked, a brave crown losing its warmth. She remembered Hannah saying, "Never cross alone," and the rule felt big and kind. She sang, Twinkle, in hiccupy pieces, as if building a bridge of sound. Frost painted silver on her lashes and turned blinks into tiny flashes. The log behind her felt like a bear that forgot to breathe. Snow moved sideways, sewing sky to ground with bright thread. The hawk hunched on a branch above, a witness made of patience and bone. Mira pressed her red mittens to her cheeks and said, "I wait." The wind tried to pull the word away, but some of it stayed with her skin. The hawk shifted once, knocking ice from feathers like glass beads, and watched the clearing with courtroom stillness. Bear broke from the trees and saw the small shape, then softened his whole body into an invitation. He curved his approach, eyes lowered, tail level with care. He said with breath, "Friend," and moved close enough to share heat without stealing space. Mira blinked at the big dog and said, "Doggy?" And the question warmed the air. The creek quieted as a crust of ice thickened, as if listening. Snow eased for a heartbeat, a mercy that felt deliberate. Asha's gray shape flickered at the far fence, and then was gone, a rumored ally. Bear touched his nose to Mira's mitten, and tasted salt and sugar. He positioned his flank to the wind, and built a wall out of fur and will. The night, offended by kindness, gathered strength and tried again. Bear, a 3-year-old male Alaskan Malamute, with a torn right ear, approached Mira in a curve, moving like snowmelt around a stone. He breathed her scent, milk, cinnamon, salt, and his eyes softened. Mira, a 2.5-year-old female in a blue star snowsuit, blinked up at him with frost-laced lashes. He brushed her mitten with his nose, feeling the thin heat of her tiny hands through the wool. "Your cold, small star?" he told her in the language of his chest, low and steady. He turned broadside, letting his ruff catch the wind and his flank give warmth. Mira's head fell gently into his fur, her small breath syncing with his rhythm. The storm hissed disapproval like a kettle left to boil too long, but Bear stayed still, a living wall against the dark. The creek's whisper curled under the wind, carrying the smell of ice and stone. Bear lowered his head over her and decided the night would not win while he had breath. On the ridge, Leena, an early 30s female SAR handler in reflective jacket and black beanie, swept a handheld thermal camera in a slow arc. "Nothing yet," she said into the radio, voice clipped by the cold. Koda, a 5-year-old male German Shepherd, stood beside her, ears flicking at phantom sounds. "Crossing into North Pasture, parents on site," she reported, the radio crackling back. "Copy." Her headlamp beams stitched the dark into narrow corridors of light. Tire tracks behind her filled instantly with blowing snow, erasing the path home. She kept one hand on Koda's harness and one on the camera, scanning for the bloom of heat that meant hope. Her breath smoked out in steady, measured pulls, each one counting the distance between the ridge and the creek. Bear circled Mira once, testing the wind, then folded himself down, curling into a thick comma that enclosed her. His spine took the storm's bite while his belly gave her the deep warmth of life. "Sleep a little but not deep," he told her with a wuff. Mira's breath fell into the slow cadence of safety. The creek hushed under a growing shelf of ice, its voice dimming to a murmur. Above, the hawk tucked its head under a wing, granting them secrecy. Snow gathered on Bear's back in small dunes, but he didn't shake it off. It was better insulation than nothing. He kept his ears pricked for the sound of approach, guarding the fragile stillness they had made together. From the tree line, a coyote emerged, ribs showing like parentheses around hunger. It froze at the edge of Bear's scent wall. Bear lifted his head without moving the rest of his body, eyes reflecting moonlight like two small lanterns. His growl was low and ancient, a sound that lived in nights before fences. The coyote's ears flattened, and it muttered to itself, "Not worth the cost," before melting back into the trees. The storm swallowed the sound of its retreat. Mira stirred but didn't wake, her face pressed into the dense fur of Bear's neck. Bear lowered his head again, keeping the night's teeth at bay. At the farmhouse, Ilias tied the neon tarp high enough to be seen through the snow's curtain. "Here!" he shouted into the wind, voice torn to shreds before it reached the trees. Hannah held Mira's star-patterned blanket against her chest like a fragile relic. When Leena's truck slid into the drive, she rushed forward, pressing the blanket into the SAR handler's hands. "We'll use this for scent," Leena said, unzipping a plastic bag. Koda buried his nose into the fabric, inhaled, then sneezed and locked onto the direction of the creek. "Good boy," Leena murmured, clipping his lead. Hannah's knuckles were white against the porch rail, eyes tracking them until the night swallowed their shapes. The house lights pulsed in the snow like a lighthouse. Koda surged ahead, nose to the snow, tail high and flagging each stride. Leena, early 30s female in reflective jacket, jogged behind on the long line, boots cutting trenches. 9 tracking, fresh direction, she told the radio, breath turning to glass in the air. The wind shoved at her shoulders, but she leaned into it. Hold on, little one, she murmured, voice half to Mira, half to herself. In the pines ahead, Bear shifted, tucking Mira's booted feet deeper under his belly. Mira mumbled, dog safe, into the warmth. The storm whispered sharp across the creek, plotting to erase the trail before they arrived. Koda's paws beat out a rhythm against the drifts, and Leena matched it, every stride closing the gap between the scent and the child. The land felt like it was holding its breath. A hawk launched from a branch with a crackle of ice, wings cutting arcs through the snow-thick air. It skimmed low along the creek, a dark arrow against the white. Leena caught sight of it in her headlamp's fringe and muttered, "Guide me then," half smiling. Koda surged, nails clicking on hidden ice, the leash line taut as steel. Snow hissed along the frozen banks, marking the way. The hawk's shadow leapt ahead of them, slipping over drifts like a story moving faster than its teller. The creek muttered under its own skin of ice, the sound winding between gusts. Leena kept her eyes on Koda, trusting 4 legs to read the ground better than she could. The hawk vanished into the pines, but its path felt like a promise. Mira stirred under Bear's curl, trying to stand on stiff legs. Her knees wobbled, but Bear eased his shoulder into her, a gentle block. Not yet, he told her in a low rumble. He shifted his position, curling tighter so his flank stayed against her side. The wind came in hard from the tree line, slapping their little camp, but Bear lifted his chin and faced it. I have more fur than you have malice, he thought, though even he could feel the cold drilling through. Mira's mitten pressed into his ruff like a small anchor. Snow settled on his back, layering in a thin armor. The creek's voice dimmed to a muted hum, and the pines cracked under the ice's weight. Bear's ears stayed high, waiting. Leena's headlamp beam caught a snag of red thread, trembling on a twig. She stopped, crouched, and pinched it free. Mira's mitten yarn. Track confirm, she said into the radio, her voice firm now. Koda's breath came in fast clouds, his nose locked into the narrow lane of scent. The trees crowded closer here, their trunks black against the snow's glow. The sky seemed to sink lower, night thickening with the promise of more storm. Leena stepped where Koda stepped, trusting his red of the ground. The red thread curled in her glove like a talisman, a fragile proof of direction. Somewhere ahead, the cold was still winning, but she felt the line between them shorten. Ash, the gray male barn cat, ghosted along the fence line, his paw prints weaving between Leena's boot tracks and Koda's paw marks. He paused to shake snow from his whiskers, tail high, then darted ahead again. I'll mark the way, he might have said if cats traded words. Back at the pasture's far edge, the chestnut mare stood square to the wind, ice feathering her mane. She blinked slow, unafraid, the still witness to the night's gamble. The farmhouse beams creaked, holding its heat tight while the blizzard gnawed at its corners. Leena noticed the cat's prints and smiled once. Every trail mattered when the cold wanted erasure. Koda's pull grew stronger, the scent was thickening. The creek's voice grew louder, breaking through the snow's hiss. Koda slowed, then pulled left, nose carving into the drift. He froze, ears pricking, tail rigid. Leena's breath caught. Alert, she whispered. From somewhere ahead came a thin, high sound, bird-like, but threaded with human weakness. She keyed the radio, possible voice contact. Snow clung to her lashes, melting and refreezing. Mira, stay where you are, she shouted into the wind, knowing a toddler might not understand, but needing to try. Koda pawed at the snow, shifting from foot to foot, his breath clouding the beam of her headlamp. The cold pressed against her back like a wall she'd have to push through. She adjusted her grip on the line and moved toward the sound, heartbeat drumming in time with Koda's pull. In the clearing, Mira lifted her head at the faraway voice. "Mama," she tried, but it came out small. The cough that followed shook her shoulders. Bear's ears swiveled toward the sound. He answered with a short bark, sharp, low, and meant to carry without frightening her. He tilted his head, catching the scent of human and dog mingled with diesel, wool, and coffee. He almost rose, but the warmth he guarded was worth more than motion. Heat was the wall that kept the night's cold teeth out. He leaned down and licked the frost from her cheek, tasting the salt of her skin and the ice she'd worn too long. Mira's mitten curled into his ruff, as if she understood his choice without words. Leena pressed forward, planting each step with care to keep her footing. Koda nosed through a drift, then barked once, deep, pointed, and certain. "We're coming, Mira. We have warm blankets," she called, voice firm but gentle. Into her radio, "Found them, moving to contact." Snow swirled like powdered glass in her headlamp beam. The storm's growl eased for a heartbeat, as if listening. Koda strained on the line, every muscle tuned to the invisible path. Leena kept her eyes forward, pulse sharp with hope and urgency. The ground dipped toward the creek, and she could see the faint hollow of a log through the white. Bear caught the new scent fully now, dog and human layered over the cold. He lifted his head, meeting Koda's eyes across the drift. No sound, just a silent exchange. "I guard, you help." Koda dipped his head, his posture soft with respect. Mira's eyes widened. "Two doggies," she whispered, her voice wobbling between wonder and exhaustion. The wind curled around them, carrying away the sharpest bite of cold, as if acknowledging the truce. Bear stayed curled around her, but his ears tracked every movement. The storm, sensing a shift, changed its tune to a restless murmur. Leena slid her pack from her shoulders and spoke low and steady. "Hey there, sweet pea, I'm Leena. I brought warm." She wrapped Mira and Bear together in a reflective blanket, trapping his heat with hers. "Good boy, hold perimeter," she told Koda, who stood watch at the clearing's edge scanning the trees. Into the radio. "Child located, conscious, hypothermic risk. Initiating warming protocol. EMS to farmhouse." Mira burrowed into Bear's fur inside the crinkling foil and murmured, "Bear warm," as if that was the only truth she needed. Leena adjusted the wrap, tucking every edge against the wind. The creek's murmur and the storm's roar became a background to the quiet thrum of survival. Leena checked Mira's tiny fingers, counting each one quickly before sliding the toddler inside her insulated jacket against her chest. Bear stayed curled beside them, the foil blanket still draped over his back like a knight's cape. "You did so brave," she murmured into Mira's hair. To Bear she said, "You hero." And he blinked slowly, accepting the word as if it were a gift he understood. Koda circled once, and then settled at their flank nose into the wind. Above, the hawk wheeled once through the white, then vanished upstream, its vigil ended. Leena shifted her weight, readying to move, every motion careful not to break the warmth they'd built in the snow's hostile cradle. They moved as a strange unified creature, Leena carrying Mira under her coat, Bear pressed on their windward side, and Koda leading with the long line taut. The snow tried to fill their tracks as soon as they made them. "Step, breathe, step," Leena repeated, voice a metronome. The creek's edge tugged at boots with icy grasp, and branches overhead bowed under their snow burden. Ash, the gray barn cat, flitted ahead between drifts, tail high, vanishing and reappearing like punctuation in the storm. Bear's breath steamed heavily, each exhale proof of his resolve. The farmhouse was somewhere behind the curtain of snow, but the line between here and there was narrowing. Halfway to the pasture, the storm threw a tantrum, thick flakes whipping in all directions. Leena ducked into a cluster of firs for shelter, crouching to blow warm air into Mira's cupped hands. "Almost there," she whispered. Bear stood braced like a snow-carved statue, letting drifts mound along his spine without flinching. Koda shook violently, sending an arc of ice crystals spinning into the dim light, then leaned his shoulder into Leena's thigh as if to lend her his own steadiness. The wind rattled the treetops like an impatient drum roll. Mira's eyelids fluttered, but she kept her mittened grip in Bear's fur. Light sliced through the trees, Ilyas's headlamp bouncing with his steps. Hana followed, a blanket wrapped over her shoulders like wings. Mira. Hana's voice cracked as she saw the bundle in Leena's arms. We have her. Leena called back, stepping forward and transferring the toddler into her mother's arms without breaking the foil wrap. He kept her core warm. Don't strip him yet, she said, nodding to Bear. Hana's sob became a laugh as she pressed her cheek to Mira's hat. Bear's tail thumped once, heavy and deliberate, like a judge closing a case. The wind swirled around them, suddenly less certain of its claim. The last 100 yards felt like crossing a bridge made of breath and hope. Hana hummed a shaky lullaby as they moved, Ilyas steadying Leena over the slick footbridge. Koda ranged ahead, scanning. Bear paced alongside, a living windbreak for the child, now safe in her mother's arms. Ash danced along the rail, his paws silent on the snow-slick wood. The farmhouse grew from a glowing square into a room that smelled of soup and safety. Behind them, the storm clawed uselessly at the shutters, its claim on the night undone. Warmth waited at the threshold, and every step made it more real. Steam curled from mugs on the kitchen table, carrying the scent of chamomile and honey. Hana, late 20s female with a dark braid, rubbed Mira's toes between warm towels, her hands trembling in relief. Leena, early 30s female SAR handler, read vitals into her phone, noting, warming slow, no rapid heat. Ilyas, early 30s male, set a heavy ceramic bowl of water before Bear. The 3-year-old male Alaskan Malamute drank deeply, then rested his head on Mira's knee as if claiming his place. Mira, 2.5 years old in her Blue Star snowsuit now unzipped, patted his skull with small deliberate fingers and whispered, "My bear." The room's air loosened, the wood stove popping like knuckles after a long hold. Outside, the storm's howl thinned to a restless murmur against the window. A county deputy stepped into the doorway, his jacket powdered with snow. He looked at Bear under the foil blanket and said, half joking but reverent, "We should pin a medal on him." Leena smiled faintly, replying, "He already wears it," tapping the scar on Bear's ear. Koda, the 5-year-old male German Shepherd, curled near the stove, snoring in low, rhythmic bursts. Ash the barn cat hopped onto the back of a chair, tail wrapping neatly around his paws, overseeing the room like a judge in session. Outside, snow softened the sharp edges of the world, burying the night's danger in white silence. The truth unfolded softly, like a memory warming after years of frost. Bear had not always been theirs. The spring before, someone had tied him to a post and left the chain cutting into his ear until it scarred. Hana had said then, "Well, keep him for a week," but weeks grew into seasons. Tonight he had given them more than loyalty, he'd given them back their daughter. Outside, the storm faded, and the post where he'd once been tied stood rusted in an empty lot miles away, claimed by weeds instead of cruelty. Family, Hana thought, is who keeps you warm when the weather turns against you. Mira, pink-toed now and drowsy, tugged Bear's ruff with solemn authority. "Bear, sleep here," she declared. Hana laughed through the last of her tears. "Yes, here," she promised, spreading a quilt beside Mira's cot by the stove. Bear curled there without hesitation, his flank touching the cot's edge. Koda rose and patted over, nosing Bear's shoulder in silent acknowledgement. "Good work, brother." The stove's firelight flickered over them, warm enough to hold back the rest of the night. The air in the room slowed, settling into the easy rhythm of survival turned to safety. Morning remade the farm in gold and white. Fences wore sugared edges, and the air smelled clean enough to forgive. Hana opened the door, stepping out with Ilyas, each holding one of Mira's hands. "Snow nice when not mean," Mira announced to the stillness. Bear trotted ahead, his gait light, as if he'd shed the last shadow of his old life. Overhead, the hawk carved bright ribbons into the sky, circling once before vanishing. Miles away, in an empty lot, a bent post stood alone, wrapped in weeds, a marker of what had been and what would never be again.